You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Good morning, everyone, or hello, wherever in the world you are today. This is Leadership Powered by Common Sense, and I'm your host, Doug Thorpe. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that we're going to present a little bit different twist and an alternative. A popular word that I have worked with in my coaching world since the pandemic is this word resilience. A lot of talent development and management people are talking about it. Executives at all levels, in all forms, and all kinds of business are talking about it. We might be at the point it's worn out, as maybe it needs to be revived. I don't know. But my guest today is going to help us with a little bit of a different twist, starting with some of her own experience and things she learned through the pandemic. Her name is Rebecca Weaver. Rebecca, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I think the way we're going to tee this up fits well in what we usually do on this show. I usually always ask my guests to give me a little bit of background story and talk about your journey and what it is that's gotten you to the place you are, and more importantly, what's motivated you to talk about the things you like to talk about. So take it away wherever you want to start with that.
Great, thank you. Well, yeah, I have a couple of stories. First of all, the company that I run is called HR Uprise, and it started as an Instagram account. So we can dive into that story a little bit later if we have time. But this concept of resilience was something that has really been tested for me and really led me on a journey. So I left my full-time job to focus on my company full-time in July of 2019. And I was building this business and feeling like I was getting some great momentum. And then January of 2020, as we now all know, right, really was a traumatic time. And for me, added on top of that was a cancer diagnosis. So I was diagnosed in the very beginning of January 2020, and I live in the Seattle area. My husband is an emergency physician, and he works at the hospital where they treated the first COVID patient in the United States. So COVID hit us very, very early here in a big way. So it was not long after my diagnosis, and the first month after a cancer diagnosis, at least for me, was filled with endless doctor's appointments. And really the goal at that point was to put together the treatment plan. It was just before my 41st birthday. So it's considered very, very young to be diagnosed with cancer. In fact, I looked at the statistics. I had a less than 1% chance or risk factor of being diagnosed. I had no history in my family. I don't have the genetic markers, none of that. So we're in the midst of all of this. And then COVID really starts to heat up here in the United States. So we made the decision shortly after I began chemo. So my treatment plan that we were putting together was 5 full months of chemotherapy. So it was 16 rounds in total of some of the toughest chemotherapy that's out there. And then mine was breast cancer. So I had a double mastectomy scheduled. So massive surgery. And then 7 weeks of radiation after that. So that was a plan that we put together. And not long after I started chemo, we made the decision that my husband had to move out to keep me safe, to keep our kids safe. So our daughters were 6 and 3 at the time. And so it was just me and the girls here as I went through chemo. And we were really fortunate to have some amazing friends who offered up their basement to my husband where he could stay while he continued to go to work. So he was going to work every day, treating COVID patients and, doing the work that is so critically important to him but also to our family. And so on the days that the weather was nice, he would sit outside on the porch and we would stay inside and we would talk through the screen door. And on the days where the weather wasn't so great, we would do the same thing in the garage, always, of course, keeping more than 6 feet apart. And so that's how we went through 5
Wow.
months at the very
Wow.
beginning of the pandemic. So it was in the middle of this that I learned about a concept called post-traumatic growth. And it was something I'd never heard of. I was really familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of us are PTSD, right? And I think there's a lot more conversation around
Right.
PTSD, but post-traumatic growth is a concept in psychology that describes this phenomenon where a certain subset of people who experience a traumatic experience are actually able to grow and thrive after this traumatic experience. And one of the things that really hit home for me, and one of the things I've been thinking a lot about since that experience, has been this concept about the difference between post-traumatic growth and resilience. So I interviewed a psychologist who studied post-traumatic growth, and this is how she described it. So resilience is the question of, I've gone through this really challenging experience. How can I bounce back, as quickly as possible and kind of get back to where I was? And the concept of post-traumatic growth is, I've gone through this trauma and there is nothing to bounce back to. What I had before does not exist anymore. And I'd been looking for some way to describe this experience. In my mind, it was these experiences that we have where we walk through a door and it slams shut behind us, right? What we had before doesn't exist anymore. And so I've really been spending a lot of time working and talking with leaders about, what does that mean for us? We've all collectively experienced this trauma of the pandemic, and it changed everything.
Right.
What we had before doesn't exist anymore. So what does that mean for us now going forward?
Well, powerful story. And let me ask first, how you doing now? Are you health-wise?
Thank you for asking. I'm doing really well. Physically, for the most part, I am better. Of course, there are countless scars, and physical and emotional. The ironic thing about a lot of cancer treatment is I do have some lingering side effects. I have a cough that comes out of nowhere and it's chronic, and that's really fun in the COVID times to have a chronic cough. But
Right.
the ironic part is all of the things that I suffer from now are actually from the treatment, not necessarily from the cancer. But
Right.
I am
Right.
grateful for amazing medicine and amazing team of physicians who, by the way, were all women. That was amazing. My entire team was all women, all female doctors. So yes, I'm doing very well now. Thank you.
Well, good. So happy to hear that. And the idea, and boy, I you packed a lot into your story, so I'm going to kind of break this down a little
Yeah.
bit. The idea of compounding the impact of it for your husband to suggest he needed to move out for protection of the family, given what he was exposed to every day. That's just, oof, gut wrenching to realize that there's a need for such a move because of the impact of the event and things that were going on. And I will say, I agree with you totally. People, and I'll say this, what I'm getting ready to say, based on leaders in various business environments. There are so many that are still looking for a return to the old normal. And there's just no such thing. The way you said it is exactly right. The old normal just really doesn't exist. Your business might be still producing the same things the same things it used to do, but I guarantee you that every one of the people on your team are thinking differently about work, about life, about family, about community, all the things that make us individual and unique human beings. People's mindsets have totally shifted. And there's not a member of the workforce anywhere that doesn't think differently about what they believe about the job.
Absolutely. It
And
changed.
if you're a leader in that space, you do have a big challenge. There is no old normal to get back to.
That's absolutely right. It changed every single one of us. And you see the impacts. So we had the great resignation, right? Which in my mind was the great reevaluation.
Yeah.
We all had this time to, consider, how in the heck did I drive into work, at least an hour each direction, 5 days a week? Why did I do that?
Why did I do that? Yeah.
Why did I do that? And I don't ever want to do that again.
Right.
So what about the work that I'm doing? I mean, for me, this is a really personal, I call it my daily aggressive reminder that confronting my mortality at a very young age really has given me this very aggressive daily reminder. You do not know what tomorrow brings. Tomorrow is not promised to any of us.
Right.
And so what that does is it gives me this question of, okay, so now what? What are you going to do? And for me, it means that the work that I do needs to be really, really impactful, that it needs to be meaningful. And I think so many people went through a very similar kind of process, is what I'm getting from this job worth it in terms of, what I'm giving, and doing that kind of return on investment analysis. And then we see these, more recent waves of the quiet quitting and things like that. And again, I think it's all part of this same process in my mind, where people are really going through and asking themselves, so now what?
Yeah. And one other dimension of all that is something I've mentioned before, and that is that prior to the pandemic, people were in pursuit of this mysterious thing they called work-life balance.
Yeah.
And I was already realizing, by virtue of my coaching experience, that people that were really stuck on trying to figure that out really never found a solution. It was kind of this mysterious void that was just never solved. And what I realized coming out of COVID, I've encouraged people to change their thinking on that. The whole notion of work-life balance, the reason it couldn't be achieved is because it was requiring this give and take. And you didn't always have control of what you were going to give up. You didn't always have control of what you were going to take. So you never got there. But the new phrase, and just not to mince words, but the new phrase that I think is more indicative of this situation is work-life harmony.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is going on simultaneously.
Yeah.
What your spouse is doing, what your kids are doing, what your relatives are doing, what your neighbors are doing. All of that is going on simultaneous with whatever you choose to do for work. And the real challenge in all of that is, can you be present in the moment? If your spouse needs attention and needs to have a moment, can you be present in that moment?
Yeah.
And turn off everything else and be available and be present. And similarly, in fairness, when the work demands full attention, can you give full attention at work, or are you tugged away by personal matters that you're struggling with?
Yeah. I mean, so I've worked in HR for 22 years now, and I have said for my entire career, there's no such thing as leaving it at home. There's no such thing. We are all human beings. We are people who have full lives, who have challenges and drama and all kinds of wonderful things happening. I mean, there are so many aspects of us being fully human, and there's absolutely no way to leave it at the door, or leave it at home.
Right.
And it has never been more true than it is now. We got the absolute extreme view to that during the pandemic when lockdown happened And, many of us, so for those of us who are parents, we got more time with our kids, which was wonderful, but it also burned us out,
Right.
because we're juggling the home, the Zoom school and trying to keep jobs going and, keeping ordering groceries to be delivered, like all of these things, right? And so I do think harmony is a better, it's something better to strive for than balance. Cause as you said, the give and take just doesn't, it's not realistic. But there's this huge conversation right now about this return to office return. And I always have a little bit of, the red flag goes off when I hear the term return, because again, really what I want leaders to think about is the fact that again, we don't have the same thing to return to. And so what I think is much more important for leaders to think about, I don't necessarily advocate for all remote work either, because that doesn't work for everybody. And there are certainly huge benefits to being together in person. But number one, I want leaders to be really intentional, not just, okay, well, here we go. We now have the opportunity to call everybody back, but how and why? What is the purpose of us getting together? What is the value that we feel like is much greater in person than it might be for, the flexibility that remote work can offer? So it really is that intentionality that I want leaders to think about.
Right. Well, it is a hot topic, and you're spot on. I like the one word you said in there, the why. Why do you need everybody back?
Yeah.
And what goes along with that is the whole idea, what exactly do you want to accomplish when you do get everybody back together?
Yep.
I had my own experience a few years ago. Prior to the pandemic, I was working with a national agency. This was still in my consulting days. And I was about 50 miles remote from the office. And, there was an expectation that I came into the office every day. And I told him, I said, no, I'm really not going to do that, because my work is with clients. And, I can do that from my home office and or when I'm out in the field traveling to the clients. And there was no good value. Where we reached the compromise, I said, okay, when you're going to have a team meeting at the office, I will come in for that. I'll agree to do that. But what ensued was every time that happened, it was a colossal waste of time, because it was just a whole lot of nebulous chit chat. No progress was being created toward the greater good we were trying to achieve. And in fact, I got behind on project deadlines
Yeah.
because I wasted a whole day doing this silly gathering that I'm convinced was just for the benefit of the partner that ran the office. They
Yeah.
needed that social interaction. They didn't, they weren't able or willing to really do something to move the needle toward our goal.
Yeah.
And I finally, at that point, said, I'm not coming in at all. And if that's a bother for you, then we're done. I'll go do something else. And
Yeah.
so,
I mean, what you're talking about is social capital, which there is really a value in social capital. There's research that suggests that is a huge chunk of what we have lost. When we went to lockdown and a completely remote environment, that's a lot of what was lost, is just that relationship building, the water cooler conversations,
right,
oh,
right.
hey, since you're here, it reminds me of this thing that I wanted to ask you about, right? The kind of serendipitous connections that we can make with people. So there is a value to that for sure. But at the same time, again, it's this question of really, I think about it as time mastery. What most people, the vast majority of people would still tell you, employees will tell you today, that they're looking for is time mastery. It's the autonomy to be able to decide, do I have time for? Is my personality a good fit for the idle chit chat that happens before a meeting? And is that the entire purpose of me coming in? Right. Um, so it's really about having the ability to make those decisions, or to say, hey, my child has a concert this afternoon. And so rather than drive all the way in for a team meeting and then not be back in time for that, I'd like to join by Zoom so that I can still, make it to the concert on time. And having the ability and the flexibility to be able to make those decisions, that's really what it's all about. Or somebody who works from home. I mean, there's a lot of research that also talks about, for folks who are newer in their career, that they're missing out
Right.
on, in-person interactions and the coaching or the mentorship that can happen in person. And so for them to be able to decide, no, I'd much rather be in person, and be able to take advantage of those things. So that the needs are really, really different for folks depending on where they are in their career, where they are with their family or outside of work obligations, their interests, whatever that is. It really is individual. And I think that's another big shift that I really want leaders to think about, is this shift from a one size fits all approach to, we really need to look at it individually. And
Right.
and it is possible to have policies. So again, in HR, we really think about systems, and we think about, system-wide kinds of decisions. It's possible to have enough flexibility that allows for each individual to make the decisions for themselves.
Well, and a lot of it comes down to choices that people do make, and part of it is, if you're going to be a leader and you agree that, okay, I'm going to make flexibility available to everyone when we have a designated meeting.
Yeah.
You either be here in the office or we do it remotely. But for those that are remote, there's the challenge of, how do you really engage, and how do
Yeah.
you allow some sort of exchange or sharing in those serendipitous moments? Everybody seems to argue that they just don't organically happen on Zoom like they do in the water cooler
Yeah.
moment. But I argue against that, because I have been part of a number of uh, company dealings where the Zoom meetings are quite engaging,
Mhm.
because the leader sets the tone and sets the stage and allows time on the agenda for those things to happen and for people to share. And I'm working with a national group right now. Ironically, the whole company is fundamentally virtual. There is no headquarters
Mhm.
office to go to if you wanted to. Um, but once a week, there's a team call, and it's mostly just to kind of provide a moment to share what's going on in everybody's lives.
Yeah.
And
I
it's,
mean, it really does come back to that intentionality.
yeah,
That just like, in our careers, we learn how to lead an effective meeting in person. We also now all need to learn some new skills, which is how to lead an effective meeting when you're in a virtual environment, or even more so in a hybrid environment. Maybe you have some folks in person and some folks on Zoom. So it's new skills that we're all going to have to learn. And I think the really savvy leaders are the ones who are going to understand that, again, the game has changed entirely. We are not the same as we used to be. And so what are those skills that are really going to help us? It's really about future proofing your career, future proofing your leadership,
right,
to ensure that you will be able to be effective in this new world.
right. Well, before we close out, I want to go back to this thing you call post-traumatic growth. Is there a process, or a kind of a step-by-step consideration of how to get there and how to identify the opportunity?
Sure. So post-traumatic growth, in leadership, it's the topic of a book I have coming out next year. So I'll talk you through, there are three major components to leadership in this new world. And the first is really about adaptive leadership. It's looking at flexibility over rigidity, right? Having quick decision making. How do we handle crisis and uncertainty? But it's really about, again, that adaptive leadership style. So that's the first component. The second part is what I refer to as empathic culture. But it's about recognizing us as holistic human beings. How do we help provide the environment for well-being in a holistic sense for our employees? How do we build community? And then also, how do we nurture the talent that we have? And again, it really comes back to a lot of what we've been talking about, the focus on the individual, and how do we do that on a larger scale? And then the last part is really about strategic agility. How do we pivot? How do we empower our team with transparency? And again, from a strategic standpoint, I think the best leaders I have always worked with are the ones who have the ability to understand things from the macro level and then also understand how that applies on the micro level. So again, understanding individually, how will this impact our teams? And again, being able to see from a strategic standpoint, both from a business standpoint, how do we stay ahead of these kinds of trends? From a company culture standpoint, what does this mean for us? How do we continue to adapt to changing markets, to changing needs from our employees? So it's really that last component is really about strategic agility. But all of that is really built around the components of post-traumatic growth. So yeah, there'll be more to come next year when the book's out.
Well, you touched on several things, and I love the whole idea of adaptability and agility, and I think that's where most managers get off track. They are on a path of certain behaviors and historical events that got them to where they are, and as Marshall Goldsmith famously wrote in his book, what got you here won't get you there. And I think that speaks to the whole idea of willingness to be agile, be open to change, have the ability to lead change, because, as all the psychologists help us understand, change is hard. It's a reality of life. And these traumas can and will happen. And obviously, those are giant change events in your life, both physically, mentally, emotionally, and maybe even functionally. So how do you get past that? How do you look to some new normal that you want to aspire to be? And you're right. I'm hearing, I've heard, I should say, many stories of people who have gone through these traumas. They have a whole new lease on life, is the phrase that's popular to say. They just look at things differently. And in most cases, it does allow for some amazing growth and forward momentum rather than falling into. And I realize, sadly, many people end up in a depressed state, and they struggle to climb out of that. But there's certainly help for that if you need it. But I think being willing to forget what was and look ahead to what is, and find the opportunity and the growth in that process.
I think that's exactly right. One of the things that I learned with post-traumatic growth is it's not toxic positivity. It's not the, oh, well, everything happens for a reason. And, it's not that at all. This is, I had someone ask me once, well, I bet you wouldn't change, I see all that you've been able to do since, having cancer. I bet you wouldn't change it now. I'm like, No, I absolutely would. If I could go back and not have cancer, absolutely. No question. Um, so it's about recognizing that the challenges of life, trauma, um, difficult situations are inevitable, truly, for all of us. And so it really is about how can we accept what is. That was a big part of it for me, was accepting where I was and what was happening. And then how do we move forward afterwards? And I think for me, in the midst of wiping down the groceries as they came through the door, and things like that, in the midst of this very, very terrifying virus, and that we knew very little about, that literally killed millions of people. In the midst of all of that, it was a lighthouse for me to know that it was still possible, that past this, at some point, there would be life on the other side. And it's very difficult sometimes to be able to see that when you're in the midst of the challenge. But again, I think it's just, we spend so much time, especially in the Western world, the United States, we spend so much of our time in the workplace, doing work.
Right.
And this is the prime place for all of us to recognize what we've been through, and to collectively, what could we do to help each other move forward in a meaningful way.
Yeah. I think that's well said, and I do think it's on the shoulders of leaders in all levels of business and community that we identify the uniqueness in all of the people we serve, and celebrate that, honor that, and make decisions about policies and procedures that allow those individuals to thrive in the culture you're trying to build at your company. And I've gone on record. I've written a couple of articles this last year about the idea that I think for the most part in modern business, command and control is dead, or needs to be dead.
Absolutely.
I think there's very limited circumstances that justify a command and control attitude. And since we're talking about medical, the metaphor I've used is that if I need to go in for heart surgery, I want my surgeon to be in total command and control of that OR.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that. But when it comes to day-to-day execution of work in most other sectors, the my way or the highway kind of attitude, you're going to have people voting with their feet. They're going to go, guess what? I choose the highway. I'm gone.
Yeah.
And it's
Absolutely.
already happened.
We've already seen it. Yeah.
We've already seen it. It's not a threat. It's already happened. And for those that haven't woken up from that yet and realized it's not them, it's you, dude. You made that happen. I encourage you to, and I'm speaking to those in leadership, I'm encouraging you to take a look in the mirror and do a deep dive into your own sense of value and outlook on the world, to realize that if you want the best out of your team, you've got to let them be who they are.
That's right.
And if you somehow don't like that for a person on your team, then guess what? You might be right. That's maybe not a good fit for your team. So deal with that. Don't let it fester. Don't let it hang on. Just confront it and deal with it and move on. So I realize that's often easier said than done, but I think that's what it's going to take for people to build teams and cultures that do thrive in the new normal.
Yeah. I think that's where the empathy comes in. I mean, I certainly wouldn't argue. And again, 22 years in HR, I can tell you without a doubt that not every job is a good fit for every person. Not every company is a good fit for every employee. But it really is about, you can help people to find their next great adventure in a way that you are preserving their dignity, that we're treating them with empathy, that we're even giving critical feedback with empathy. And that is absolutely possible. That we don't have to continue. I mean, we haven't even gotten into, we probably don't have time today for workplace trauma, and all of the different ways in which the workplace and managers, leaders in particular, can create all levels of trauma for employees as well. And it does not have to be that way.
Right.
There is absolutely a way to move the business forward and to continue to be strategic and grow the business, and also have a robust and thriving workplace that will help you make that happen.
Agreed. Totally agreed. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much. And we are about up on time today. Tell the folks how they can get a hold of you if they're interested in knowing more about your work.
Sure. Well, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm Rebecca Weaver, and you can also find me at hruprise.com, HRUPRISE.com.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, as always, folks, we're going to have that in the show notes so you can just mash the links there and be able to look up Rebecca, make contact if you're interested. So one last time, thank you, Rebecca, for sharing all this, and so happy to hear your health is good and things are moving forward. So
thanks so much for having me, Doug.
All right. Well, with that, folks, we are going to sign off. I do like to remind everyone we've got a video version of this show over on YouTube, channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Just hop over there, check out all the archives and the history of shows that we've done. We're coming up pretty soon on number 300, so we'll be celebrating that when we get there. But for now, we're going to sign off, say goodbye. Go out there, make it a great day.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.